He is the greatest enigma among the Founding Fathers. He is the greatest source of controversy. He is one of the greatest writers in political history anywhere around the world. He had nearly boundless confidence in rational man's ability to perceive errors in traditional belief, according to historian Thomas Kidd. And he did more than any other founder to defend religious freedom for evangelical Christians. He might be regarded as a, quote, ethical Christian who couldn't imagine that anyone truly believed in the Trinity. He was forward-thinking in the Louisiana Purchase, but he didn't make good predictions in religion, such as, I trust there is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian. Oops. Now, of course, we're talking about Thomas Jefferson, and the real wall of separation in American politics and religion concerns his own lofty writings on freedom when compared to his practice of slaveholding. These contradictions make him the subject of many biographies, including the most recent from Tommy Kidd, Thomas Jefferson, A Biography of Spirit and Flesh, published by Yale University Press. What a great subtitle, by the way. Dr. Kidd is research professor of church history at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, and the author of many outstanding works, including The Great Awakening, The Roots of Evangelical History in Colonial America. Tommy is one of my favorite historians, and I'm delighted to invite him to Gospel Bound to discuss Jefferson's views on Christianity and politics, and we'll talk a bit about how Christians should approach history in general. Tommy, thanks for joining me on Gospel Bound.
Thanks for having me.
Simply put, should we admire Thomas Jefferson?
Well, there's no simple answer to that. And I mean, especially in our current culture, we seem to have a really hard time knowing what to do with people like Jefferson, who, for my money, is quite admirable in some important and enduring ways. And his legacy has been used for good by people like Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. But especially in his personal life, he did things that were sinful and despicable. And so, generally we go to one extreme or another with people like this. We go to extremes about everything in America these days, but we either tend to cancel them or we react with sort of patriotic apologetics and say, anything negative you say about one of these people is a lie. So we really struggle with that these days. But I would say there are some things about Jefferson that we still should admire while being candid about some of the dreadful things that he did in his life.
I think this next question is related to the first. Did he actually believe what he wrote? One of the things you argue is this: the dissonance between stated belief and practiced reality is perhaps more acute for Jefferson than any other American ever. Now, I think at some level, if this were in our own day with our understanding of politics, we'd say he was just a total cynic. But I think what's different about that era is that all of these men put their lives on the line. All of their fortunes, their very lives, their family, everything was on the line if they lost. So how do you explain that?
Well, I think it's partly that when he says all men are created equal, I think he has a narrower immediate implication of that than what we hear today. And he realized, I think, that there were different levels at which that operated. I mean, the most immediate thing that he means by that is it's a political statement about the people who are active in Anglo-American politics. And that means generally white property-owning men. Those men are created equal. People like Jefferson are created equal. And he says that and means that because really in the political sphere to Jefferson, that's all that mattered. Those were the people who were involved. And so, Jefferson did not see everyone and everything as political. He saw just a relatively small group of people in Britain and America as having a public political life. And there were people just like him. Now, the problem with that, and I think Jefferson grasped this problem, is that Jefferson turns to the language of creation in order to make that point. And so all men are created equal. And we, Jefferson knows, we know that that's a universal claim. It certainly, by the Genesis account, includes women because, male and female, he created them. And if you accept the unitary origins of the human race, which Jefferson actually raised questions about, but he knew that most Christians accepted the Adam and Eve account in some form or fashion. And so that would include all races. But Jefferson also, as the great wordsmith that he was, knew that putting it on that kind of universal theological basis was the strongest argument you could possibly make for human equality. And so he did it, and it was lovely, and it was powerful, and it has resonated through American history. But it immediately gave people ideas in 1776. For instance, the African-American pastor Lemuel Haynes wrote Liberty Further Extended in 1776, saying, oh, well, if all men are created equal, then we shouldn't have slavery. And you could just imagine Jefferson, wait a minute, that's not what we're talking about. So it kind of got out of control, out of his hands almost immediately as soon as he said it.
Speaking of something that's gotten out of hand, Jefferson's views on the separation of church and state. I know it's a broad question, but I know you can answer that succinctly as well.
Well, Jefferson is the founding era's, one of two of the greatest champions of religious liberty, for sure. And the religious liberty for Jefferson meant that the government should not be policing people's religious beliefs, shouldn't be calling balls and strikes on doctrinal issues. And it also meant that he wanted to abolish all of the state-established churches, in particular Virginia's. And so he wrote the bill for establishing religious freedom. And then in 1786, Madison got it passed through the Virginia legislature. And the Anglican Church, the Church of England, had been the state-established church in Virginia since the colony's founding. And now they say we're not going to have an official denomination, and we're not going to have any civil penalties for people having aberrant doctrinal beliefs, but that we're going to maximize people's religious freedom and take a step away from government-run religion. To Jefferson, that did not mean the public absence of religion. It certainly didn't mean government hostility towards religion, because part of what Jefferson is trying to do is to get the government to stop persecuting, most obviously, the Baptists, who Jefferson was certainly no evangelical and no Baptist, but he thought it was loathsome that the Virginia government was actively persecuting Baptists on the eve of the Revolution, with dozens of Baptist ministers being thrown in jail for illegal preaching. He thought, this is ridiculous. These people are preaching sort of a totally acceptable version of Christianity. And Jefferson also knew that if they came after the Baptists, they would also come after him, because he didn't believe in the Trinity or the divinity of Christ or the resurrection. So he thought, we just need to get the government out of the business of policing people's beliefs and just, maximize free exercise of religion. And in that was something that Baptists in particular, but a number of evangelicals, not only allied with Jefferson on that, but absolutely celebrated him because of his courageous defense of evangelical dissenters.
Now, even as a religious skeptic himself, he did seem to have a role for Christianity, specifically even in government. You mentioned that, or I guess more broadly, concept of religion, certainly in the Declaration there, but you mentioned specifically the role that he saw Christianity playing in civilizing, in his understanding, the frontier. So could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Jefferson believed, like virtually everyone in his world, that Christianity was essential to virtue for most Americans. How are you going? Where do you base are broad public ideas about morality and virtue, honesty, neighborly love, those kind of things. You don't have to make anything up. It's just within the Christian tradition. And so education was profoundly Christian. And even in a strange instance in the early 1800s, that Jefferson agreed to government funding for a Catholic mission, actually, among the Kaskaskia Indians, for a missionary priest in schools and so forth, and actually thought that it was fine for the government to even give money for that sort of thing, which I'm not sure I would think that's a good idea, but that shows you how much that Jefferson is not trying to eradicate religion or Christianity. That's for sure. And in his first inaugural address, I think maybe it's the most important moment where he talks about what are the strengths of our republic, and he gives many instances, but he says it's capped by our benign religion, and by that he meant Christianity, which inculcates virtue. I mean, and so the idea is if you're going to have a republic where the people are sovereign, you have to have a virtuous people. And for most regular people, the resource of virtue is their faith.
Now, why do you think, in light of this, why is Jefferson remembered more as a skeptic of religion than as a champion of religious freedom that benefited evangelicals, especially Baptists? Because they're both such a major part of his legacy, one of them having massive positive effects for people like you and me and institutions that we serve. But I don't really think many evangelicals would recall that about him.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has more to do with the political alignments that we have today, where you can't really imagine someone who is both heterodox personally and also a great champion of religious liberty and free exercise of religion. So this, I think, helps to account for the polarized views of Jefferson, which are totally typical and replicated in other historical figures, where the secular left claims him as being heterodox, which he was, and then being an entirely secular person as far as his view of public life in America, and that's wrong. Conversely, the Christian right can't imagine someone being a great defender of religious liberty and being heterodox, and so they say he was a great defender of religious liberty and all this, although sometimes they get nervous about the wall of separation of church and state, which he said in an 1802 letter to evangelical Baptists, by the way. And so they try to figure out some way to say that Jefferson is actually a traditional Christian, which is completely wrong. It's the epitome of trying to wedge a historical figure like Jefferson into today's culture and political alignments, which is just bad history 101.
I mean, who are the political and or religious descendants of Jefferson today? Because he seems difficult to map for the reasons you just described right there onto our current moment. I mean, even for me growing up, I still recall all of the Jefferson-Jackson dinners the Democratic Party used to do. I don't think that's happening much anymore. They don't seem to want to claim him as their founder. Technically speaking, he didn't found the Democratic Party, but effectively he did. How is he supposed to fit today?
He mostly doesn't. I think you just have to start with Jefferson as he's not like anybody you know today. I mean, I do think that back in the 90s, there was this moment when Bill Clinton and the Democratic Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which I think was a good moment for religious liberty. And that was, a moment in time when I think Democrats saw threats to religious liberty, not only for Christians, but for, more minority religious groups. And so, which I'm perfectly happy for religious liberty to be defended for all those groups. And so, but I think in the past 20 years, we've really settled more into these. If you're on the left, then you're also rigidly secularist. And I mean, and Christian right acts the way that it does. And that I think is unfortunate, because I think Jefferson is, he's a classical liberal. Definitely not a traditional Christian, but in a Lockean sense. And also through the experience of watching the Baptists be persecuted in Virginia, he develops a really robust ideal of religious liberty for all, which I think is a wonderful part of the American tradition.
Well, before I come back to Jefferson, I want to ask a couple questions about historiography here. One is that it feels as though you can either choose the 1619 project approach to history or else the Mount Rushmore great men etched in stone vision. How do you think Christians ought to be viewing history, especially in this environment?
Well, I'm all for being candid about the past.
Whitefield would be a good example of that in
Whitefield,
your work.
and I was, criticized by certain outlets for being, too harsh about Whitefield's problematic relationship to slavery and slave owning. But Whitefield's another example of somebody who I admire quite a lot, but I think his connection to slavery was despicable, because he really was a pro-slavery activist, as he was, leading the First Great Awakening. So, with things like the 1619 Project, I mean, if the idea is it would be good for Americans to know when the first documented shipment of slaves came to the American colonies, I'm all for that. I think that should be part of our civic memory and something that's widely known in America. But I guess where I draw the line is, when it's really, the history is basically being used for partisan political purposes, and or history is being used to sort of tout our own virtue of saying, look how progressive we are because we hate the right people in the past. That's a pretty paltry form of virtue, and I think it's more mature, just even in a secular sense, to be chastened by the past, and to say, but for the grace of God, there go I, and to muse on what, cultural traps we might be in, and because our culture can convince us of things as being normative that definitely are not, and certainly in a Christian sense, that's true. So, I can go a long way if we're talking about historical facts, and being candid about people who we consider our historical heroes. But when it becomes an exercise in touting our own virtue because we condemn the right people in the past, that I can't go along with that.
Now, I fully expect that you will shoot me down on this next question, and you're the right person I trust to shoot me down on this one. I was thinking about this years ago with a friend, and probably because my bent is so historical, I like to frame some of our struggles in terms of historiography. It strikes me that a lot of our political battles now and cultural battles boil down to whether you think American history is basically bad with some sprinkling of good, or basically good with some rotten apples mixed in. Basically, it feels like some sort of fight between Howard Zinn and David Barton. It's kind of what it feels like to me. Do you see anything similar? Or, again, I'm sure that's overly reductionistic, but it feels like it maps pretty often on people's instincts as it relates to politics and culture.
I'm sure that that's true for the popular discussions of history, and I think it's increasingly true in the academic guild, where sort of overtly partisan polemical history now is more rewarded by history departments than ever before. But as I've said in my previous answer, I mean, I'm ambivalent about this because I think there's a theological sense in which all history is basically bad because I think we're bad
Right,
people.
right.
And so, I say this as a Calvinist. I mean, that we're not good. We're not naturally good. And people, especially when they're given power, do bad things with it. That's not universally true, but it is often true. And that, and there's just temptations that come with power. And so, I definitely wouldn't want to go in the direction of American history being uniquely bad, which I think is the tone of a lot of secular historiography today, and this sort of self-immolation about who can hate America the most and accuse the most people of being racist and so forth. I think all that's excessive. But I guess that, to me, I have, in that sense, a sort of theological view of history that there's only one person that I expect moral perfection from, is certain carpenter's son from Nazareth. And everybody, why would it be surprising that, say, Jefferson abused his power, or that Whitefield abused his power? It really would be surprising if they didn't. And in that sense, history is a warning to us, those of us who are granted various forms of power and authority, to be very, very careful, because the record historically is pretty grim about what people often do with their power.
Is that not the kind of historical or historiography done by the writers of the Bible?
Sure is. It sure is. I would say that, that for Christians looking at the Bible, we talk about David and Peter and Paul and all this, but with somebody like Paul, it fits a little more easily into the kind of Christian, pop Christian view of these things, because he did extremely bad things and then he got converted. And then he shaped up, I think with somebody like Whitefield, what's even more troubling is that God was doing great things through his ministry while he was actively involved in the sin of promoting slavery. And that is, for me personally, that is a perplexing observation.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about this lately, because I'm so grateful for a lot of the attention that's being put on the family, on the role of fathers, and all that kind of stuff. And then I'll ask people, could you give me an example of a good father in Scripture? I haven't found one yet. God the Father. But it's just amazing, given the historical examples that we have. Now we can deduce that Joseph was a wonderful stepfather to Jesus. We don't have any evidence otherwise, but the point is we don't really have any evidence one way or another about that, just very scant in there. But yeah, other than God the Father, it's just amazing that doesn't appear to be what the Bible's trying to do. It seems to be trying to show us something that's common to humanity in contrast to the God-man. So anyway, well, a couple last questions on Jefferson. Thanks for working through some of that historiographical and biblical work with me. But you write this, that in contrast to the classical Protestant belief in salvation by grace alone, Jefferson believed that God would save people who behaved morally. And this belief made Jefferson especially critical of the French reformer John Calvin. I was kind of surprised to know that Jefferson had engaged with Calvin's work, though I think it's worth noting that Jefferson's biggest political opponents were descended from the Puritans in New England, which has to be that can't be a coincidence there. But I thought you also point out that he described his views as anti-Calvinist. And then this is just hilarious, that Calvin was an atheist and that his religion was demonic. Not like he exactly held back on this. Now, I was wondering, did it have anything to do with his affinity for the French revolutionaries? It could have been multiple angles he was coming in at this on, whether through France or his just anti-federalist view, or just straight up theological interest. Tell us a little bit more about his anti-Calvinist views.
Yeah, it definitely is political, that he finds that the people who are his staunchest political adversaries, or at least out of a Calvinist background in New England, and many of them are Calvinist pastors or politicians. And so he associates their politics with their theology. But he also, as with many things like this with Jefferson, he really does have a clear theological stance, that he's just allergic to anything that to him seemingly confounds common sense. And so he thinks that, and I actually think Jefferson is right in the assumption that he's making. I mean, that it seems like most people around the world throughout time who are not converted Christians think that your good works are the key to whatever salvation looks like. I mean, that seems to be sort of the common sense of the matter until God intervenes with his grace. I mean, so I think what Jefferson is saying is that this, ideas about election and predestination, and you can't contribute anything to your salvation, and it's completely out of your hand. He just says it's not reasonable. What's reasonable to Jefferson is that you do more good than bad, and God will see that. It's just what he's saying is unbiblical. So I think that that's where it's coming from. It's similar in that sense to his view of the Trinity. I mean, he says this it doesn't make any sense. It literally does not add up, and so it can't be true.
So just clarify my lack of understanding here. Madison, of course, his disciple, is educated by the Calvinists, right, in Princeton?
Yes, he's a Witherspoon student.
Right, Witherspoon student.
At Princeton. Yeah.
Right, so you're going to get that Presbyterian theology and some of that common sense realism, things like that, right? But Jefferson did have some of that, but not to the same degree as Madison. Is that correct?
No, and I mean there are Calvinist sources within Jefferson's Anglican tradition, and the 39 articles of the Anglican Church is pretty distinctively Calvinist, and Jefferson is very learned in theological debate and all that. I don't know that he certainly didn't read Calvin extensively. So, I mean, I think he is talking about Calvinism as represented by his Federalist political enemies. But his familiarity with religious topics really is mostly about the Bible itself, of which he's deeply familiar, especially in Greek. He regularly reads the Bible, the New Testament in Greek, and he regularly reads the Septuagint in Greek, just for personal edification, which is extraordinary when thinking about it. He's the president of the United States, and he's taking time to read the Bible in Greek. And so he really is quite learned about a lot of these things. But he when they're putting together the library of the University of Virginia, he looks to Madison to tell him more about what theologians should be included.
Forgive me for forgetting from the book, but was Jefferson's Anglicanism influenced by the Latitudinarian movement?
I'm sure it was.
Broadly speaking.
I think he to the extent. I mean, I don't think he defined himself as an adult as an Anglican, though he was. I mean, he was a vestryman at times in terms of a lay leader in the Anglican Church, but I think he, pretty quickly came over to that mentality of, as he said to one correspondent, "I am a sect by myself, so far as I know." That he's just sort of saw him as an individual, ethical Christian, but part of no denomination.
Yeah, I was just wondering, some of the stuff he's talking about, it was just in the air at the time. It's like not all that it wasn't entirely unique to him. Even within his Anglican tradition, there were plenty of movements toward this ethical Christianity that you're describing.
That's right. I mean, a lot of people are interested in, and I think Ben Franklin is this way, that coming out of the Puritan tradition,
right, but
tired of fighting about theology and doctrine, and can't we just have an only ethical version of Christianity?
And Adams himself also, famous opponent turned good friend, died the same day, was also from one of the lapsed Puritans there as well. The last question I had, just a little bit of scene setting in light of especially your entire corpus. I think many American evangelicals might be surprised that the founding coincided with an ebb in Christian practice, especially with church membership. I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit more of that context in terms of the unique spiritual conditions of the late 18th century. One of the big critics. And when I did a book on revivals, I did a lot with Timothy Dwight. It was pretty eye-opening to read Timothy Dwight's reflections on the state of Yale when he came to take it over.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you look at it, I suppose. I mean, people like Dwight are always given to sort of, I mean, the Puritans and you know, the Jeremiah tradition, and it continues in the church today. You know, everything's worse than it's ever been before. And I mean, I think, you know, pastors, when they say that, really mean it. But it's also a rhetorical move for mobilizing the church. But I do think that there was a transition time at the you know, during the Revolutionary era, when the traditional denominations, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, were somewhat languishing, especially as settlement moved out onto the frontier. And you have the coming of the Baptists and the Methodists, who are going to be the ones who win the frontier for American religion. And they're going to change the whole landscape of American religion during the Second Great Awakening. But the Revolutionary period, in that sense, is a kind of shifting and change. But, you know, if you're talking about, say, church affiliation, the percentage of church affiliation in America is much higher by, say, 1850 than it is in 1776.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to get at there. I mean that explains it so well, that was a unique transition period from the largely institutionally based, I mean, in a sense, revivalism of the Puritan history into the more democratic, populist religions that we come to know today, at a time of significant Enlightenment influence through a variety of sources, English, Scottish, of course, as well as French. So I think a lot of people just don't think of that, because as Christians, we're so oriented toward thinking about our origin story, both biblically, and then we kind of equate that with the American founding, not realizing the American founding's origin story from a religious perspective is quite unexpected. We just think of so much of the founding era as being the purview of the God and country types, and it just wasn't quite that way. I know you've done so much work on this with Barton's work and everything else. Yeah,
it's just more complicated than we tend to think. But I mean, what I'm struck by is that, you know, the Methodists and Baptists in particular matched the massive growth on the frontier in the early 1800s with what amounts to one of the most successful church planting campaigns in human history. I mean, because as massive as the growth was, the church growth was even greater. And so it's a neat story, but it sort of doesn't fit, you know, because American Christians think it must have been the best at the time of the founding and then got worse from there. Mm-hmm. But it's not quite that way.
Not the case. I mean, you can see it all through American history. You know, the early 20th. You know, beginning of the 20th century, kind of high period, but then there's significant decline, and then the post-war period, significant increase, and then another decline. That's kind of, you know, been in place at least, you know, since the 90s in some ways, early 90s in some ways. So I think a lot of people I think it might be comforting to them to know that it's a series of ebbs and flows. It's not just some sort of peak and then a collapse.
Right, and that's even more true globally. I mean, just
absolutely.
People will say, can revival happening again? And I'm like, well, it's going on
all over the place.
Iran and China. I mean, so what are you talking about? Of course, it can happen. It's happening right now.
And I think, I mean, this would be too again reductionistic to say, but I don't know how many people could be more attributed to that growth that peaked around 1850 and into the Civil War than Thomas Jefferson. I mean, I don't know how many people would be more responsible for that between the Louisiana Purchase and because of his views on religious liberty and defense of the Baptists and other non-establishment religions.
Right. And I mean, Jefferson and Madison, I think, you know, in all sincerity, they made the argument that Christianity will be stronger if we get the government out of the business of promoting denominations. And they're right. It's just not the form of Christianity that Jefferson thought.
It's true. He did think, yeah, exactly. Going back to the quote, I trust there is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian. Right. Thankfully, he was wrong about that. I've been talking with Tommy Kidd of Midwestern Seminary about Thomas Jefferson, a biography of spirit and flesh, new from Yale University Press. Final three here, quick ones, Tommy. How do you find calm in the storm?
Oh, well, that answer begins and ends with the Lord. That's for sure. But and His faithfulness. In the worldly equation, I find it through fishing.
Nice.
I'm quite an avid kayak fisherman, so
Okay.
that's my peaceful place.
You're learning to explore the areas, your new environs.
Exploring and catching.
Very good. And where do you find good news today? Perhaps you've already alluded to that with Iran and China and some of those global revivals.
Yeah, I think when you look at the global church, including immigrant populations in America, that there's lots of reason to be encouraged. It seems like the evangelical church in America, especially native born, is in some decline. But as you said, I mean, those patterns come and go in the Lord's providence, and but there's plenty of hotspots of revival happening around the world, and some, like in Iran, we can infer that there's even a lot more going on there than can be documented. So there's reason to be encouraged.
And finally, what's the last great book you've read?
I read a terrific book about, I forget the author, but it was about the background to Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I think the book was called The Sinner and the Saint. And I'm not a Dostoevsky expert, but I am a big fan of Dostoevsky. So I love, in my free time, quote unquote, which basically means my commute, I listen to a lot of books like that.
Wonderful. And Tommy Kidd has been my guest on Gospel Bound, talking about Thomas Jefferson, a biography of spirit and flesh. Thanks, Tommy.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Gospel Bound. For more interviews and to sign up for my newsletter, head over to tgc.org/gospelbound. Rate and review Gospel Bound on your favorite podcast platform so others can join the conversation. Until next time, remember, when we're bound to the gospel, we abound in hope.